If you've been watching the latest season of Stranger Things, you may have noticed a thing or two that came up during the show that caused some questions. So today, we're going to talk a little bit about the moral panic of the 1980s. Dungeons & Dragons was published in 1974 by Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. And it was a very small publication at the time. They didn't do a huge run. They didn't have a lot of money. And they didn't know it was going to turn into the massive juggernaut that it is today, obviously. At the time, they saw some success on college campuses, and there was a lot of widespread use of the game. But it wasn't until about 1979 when there was a very kind of public case of a disappearance, a student, a 16-year-old student at Michigan State University named James Dallas Egbert III, who reputedly went into the steam tunnels near the school and never came out. He was playing some live-action D&D, according to private investigator William Deere, who admittedly didn't really know much about the game, but assumed that it was largely involved. Now, it turns out that Egbert didn't really do much disappearing beyond running off to Louisiana, and he eventually resurfaced. But that part of the story wasn't really talked about much in the popular media, as you can understand. Deere did publish a novel, a book called The Dungeon Master, that documents his investigation, and it was a popular read. And also helped to inspire Rona Jaffe's Mazes and Monsters, which was then turned into a feature film starring a very young Tom Hanks, sadly. But we don't hold that against Tom. He's a pretty good guy. The following year, we saw the first parent advocacy group, I can say it, honest, where they really got behind the idea of abolishing D&D in schools and from groups that their kids were involved in. That was in Heber City, Utah. Their activism inspired groups in Carroll County, Maryland in 82, Janesville, Wisconsin in 83, Baltimore in 84. They got the attention of Pat Robertson and his Christian Broadcasting Network that got behind it and discussed the various occultism and Satanism that and suicide and pornography and murder, anything they could pin on kids getting involved with this game and it turning them into monsters. And that was a kind of a linchpin of the moral panic that developed around Dungeons and Dragons at the time. Now, if you were there as a kid, you lived through this. And I did. And it was kind of disheartening when the 700 Club ran its report and my grandmother in the next room is audibly shaking her finger at me and telling me that devil game is going to lead nowhere good, while my mom rolled her eyes and kept her mouth shut to avoid, inter-family conflict. But my parents were pretty chill. I was fortunate. And I went ahead and got involved in playing D&D and eventually other role-playing games over the years. And the moral panic never really touched my household much. A lot of people weren't so lucky. In fact, I lived in Kansas, and famously in 81, a Kansas evangelical minister bought and burned a ton of D&D books as a way of mounting a protest. In 1982, in Richmond, Virginia, Patricia Pulling founded the group Bothered About Dungeons and Dragons, BADD, bad, after her son Irving committed suicide. He was involved in the gaming. Obviously, there's no reason for us to think that gaming had anything to do with his suicide, because there's a lot of other things going on when people do that, clearly. But she was very, very upset about it, and she sued the principal of his school for allowing this sort of thing to go on under his watch. She even eventually sued TSR Games, but that suit was dismissed in 1984, and she went on to be a force for the controversy surrounding D&D until she died some 15 years later, sadly from cancer. But in 1984, famously, Jack Trick published a tract called Dark Dungeons. If you don't know who Jack Chick is, congratulations. There was a hilarious 2014 short film directed by Gabriel Gonda and written by J.R. Rawls, where you can see kind of a take on what, and it really is a take on the Chick tract, but with not pulling any punches about how ridiculous it is, and it is hilarious. You can find it at darkdungeonsthemovie.com. It's like a $5 watch. I've seen their sections of it on YouTube if you want to check it out, see what it's like, get a preview. Definitely worth it. 60 Minutes even ran a feature in 1985 where they talked to Patricia Poling and Pat Robertson, and they even talked to Gary Gygax, who responded to a lot of the criticism by pointing out that it was ridiculous. A lot of the outrage came from the fact that the game, particularly the Advanced Dungeons and Dragons Monster Manual, for example, involved statistics and information on demons and devils, and they used real Christian mythology and other mythology for names of these things. But, Gygax very strongly felt that the reason they put these creatures in here was so that you could fight them, you could vanquish them. They were a known evil that it felt appropriate to put in the game. They were pulling from all kinds of mythology when they made D&D into what it was. Its roots came from wargaming. It had nothing to do with this. But because clerics were there in some of the early representations of the game, and they got their powers from divine sources, and this seemed to suggest to parents that their kids were being told that they should worship false gods and that they would get some kind of power for it. You can see how it, turns into what it is, especially given the way we see in today's world, that moral outrage becomes so infectious, that you get somebody behind a pulpit who has something to say and they really go to town, and it just riles people up. And it's, the way of the world for a long time. And back then in the 80s, we didn't have the internet. We didn't have people out there debunking the things that came up, or obviously, inciting the riot. So, pros and cons, right? But the moral panic, built around kind of the satanic panic of the era, really did start to fade after the mid-'80s. There were still examples of it that would pop up from time and again. Famously, there was, I remember when I was in high school, there was like a bell tower shooter or somebody that they were looking into, and they found out he played D&D, and suddenly that became the focus of the story. Things like that. Very nice to have seen it kind of dissipate. But when I was watching Stranger Things, sure enough, there it was right out of my childhood, like a lot of stuff in that show, which is one of the things that makes it so amazing. The moral panic of Dungeons & Dragons discussed right out in the open by the principal characters, who were a D&D club, the kind that were being demonized at the time, that maybe could have chose something other than Hellfire as their name. But there you go. That's what it's all about. If you have any questions or comments you'd like to add, please go ahead and include them below in the video. If you enjoy this, I definitely recommend you check out other videos on our site. Like and subscribe, and we do a lot of gaming stuff, some actual plays, and you're going to see more content coming up in the weeks ahead. So thank you very much.